Hey everybody, it's Ian the Off Kilter Crafter. I hope you're having a great day today. I just got my Puzzle Mystery Quilt Piazza back from my quilter, and it's now time to put on the binding. I like to put my binding on by machine and not do any hand stitching. Now, some of you might say, well, Ian, you can never enter a competition using a quilt that is only machine bound. That's actually not true because my quilt, Daydreamer, the Butterfly Effect, has won multiple awards, and that binding was put on completely by machine. So you don't just have to do hand binding in order to enter your quilt into a quilt show. So today I'm going to show you how I put my binding on using my machine, which is a Bernina. However, there are plenty of other tutorials out there on YouTube with all the machines you can think of out there. Plus, Becca has a really great binding tutorial. I'm going to go ahead and link to it down in the description of this video and up in the iCards as well. It is a great machine binding tutorial that shows you multiple methods on how to bind your quilts using a machine. So I'm going to go ahead and start working on this one. The first thing that I did is I did go around the edge of the entire quilt with my serger and serge the edge of my quilt. Now your question might be, Ian, why would you use a serger to go around the quilt? Well, there's multiple reasons. First of all, it helps me trim off the excess batting and backing that I don't need, so it cleans up that edge really nicely, and it basically pancakes those layers together to make sure that I'm catching them as I'm sewing around with the binding. So it basically creates a very nice, neat package for me to use to be able to put the binding around it, and it flattens it out to make it nice and smooth. Now don't worry if you don't have a serger, this is not a required step. It's something that I like to do to my quilts, but it's definitely not required, and you don't have to do it in order to get the same result. You can do the same thing without the serger. In fact, you can also use your sewing machine and do a zigzag stitch. That zigzag stitch can have almost exactly the same effect, help keep everything in nice together, and plus it helps all those layers to make sure that they don't get bunched up or twisted in areas. So it can be helpful, but again, that is not required. The zigzag stitch isn't required, nor is the serger. It's just something that I like to do. So I finished my first step, which is to serge the edges, as I just said. Now it's time to put the binding on. I attach my binding from the front, like you would just about any other hand sewing quilt project. I'm going to apply it to the front, and I'm actually going to iron it once I get it all attached to the front, so that way it's easier to wrap around to the back. Now, I'm not going to show myself actually applying the binding from the front. There are plenty of other videos on how to do that, including Becca's. So the next time I see you, we're going to be talking about how I wrap it around to the back and do some glue basting. Okay, now that I have attached my binding with the 1/4 inch, I actually went a little bit more than a 1/4 inch, just one thread to the left, so that way it has a perfect amount of space for when I flip the binding over onto the back. But I have gone ahead and sewn it on with that 1/4 inch-ish, and now I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to iron it and press it away from the center of my quilt, so that way when I flip it around onto the back side, it gives a very nice pressed edge. So I'm going to use the iron here and go ahead and press that outwards so that it is ready to flip over onto the back side of my quilt. All right, now that I've ironed my binding outwards towards the outside of my quilt, we're going to go ahead and flip it over onto the back. And as you can see, there is a line of stitching right here down at the bottom. That is where I attached the the binding from the front side. That line right there, I need to make sure my binding goes past that line. So when I'm stitching from the front side again, it will catch the binding in that stitch. So I'm going to wrap this around and make sure that it covers that front line of stitching. It may be a little hard to see because there's of course the serged edge as well, and it might be a little hard because it's white on white to see all of it, but I'm just going to make sure that it passes that furthest in line of stitching. And if I was really wanting to like make it perfect or whatever, I could just barely pass that line, but that would leave a little extra space in the binding, and I don't want to do that. So as you can see, there's a little bit of space right here, a little empty space. I don't want to do that, at least not with this quilt. So I'm just going to wrap it all the way around. And in order to do that, I'm going to use some Elmer's school glue. I use school glue whenever I'm doing some glue-based binding. And it is perfect because it washes out. I don't have to worry about making a mess. If it gets on my iron, it's not a big deal. And it holds the binding in place, so that way I don't have to worry about it. And sometimes people will use a precision tip or even some like glue basting specific glue, but I just use Elmer's glue and I don't have any problem with it at all, and it washes out perfectly. It is my go-to, and I don't exchange the tip. I just use the one that's on the school glue like you see here, and I'm just gonna put a line of glue basting on here to create my binding. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I've opened my glue, and now I am going to go ahead and start creating a line of glue on top of that serged edge. If you didn't do serging, it's just in between the stitched line where you attach the binding on the front and the edge of the quilt. And I'm going to fold the binding over that glue, and then I'm going to grab my iron, and I'm going to go ahead and start basically heating up that glue, and for lack of better terminology, I'm going to cook that glue inside the binding, underneath that binding, and I'm going to do this all the way around the quilt. So there we go. I have put that iron on it, got it nice and hot, and it has dried the glue inside the binding. And now we'll take it over to the sewing machine once I get all of the binding attached with the glue basting. So currently on my Bernina, I have my D10 foot, and as you can see, the D10 foot has a little guide at the front of it. I'm going to use that guide and run it up against the binding and hopefully fill in a stitch line that is basically going to stitch in the ditch that is formed in between the quilt top and the binding. So I'm just going to run the stitches all the way around my quilt top, and I want my thread color to match the front of the quilt in some way, and I'm going to be using the white thread here, so it will hopefully blend in quite nicely, so when you zoom out at a far distance you won't be able to see the color that is in it. And then if I had a contrasting backing fabric, I might load my bobbin with that backing contrasting color. But thankfully, since the back of this quilt is white, it doesn't really matter, and most of the time I find it doesn't matter at all, because that back thread will be visible whenever you're running the stitch on the binding. So you will see it on the binding, but I'm not too terribly worried about the back side of this quilt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run stitches and just basically follow along the guide, keeping that binding right on that guide. And here's the final result of putting that stitch along the front. You can't even hardly see it from the front side of the quilt. It blends in very nicely to the quilt top and hides in that ditch, so you don't really see it or even hardly notice that it is there. On the back side, you will notice that there is a stitch line in the binding, so it's a good option to pick something that matches with the binding. And since this has some white in it, I figured the white stitching would be perfectly fine to see on the back side of the quilt. But again, that's the back side of the quilt. It doesn't really matter. But I do love that it blended in and kind of disappears, is almost invisible from the front side of the quilt, and looks really, really great. So there you go. It's just that easy to apply the binding to the front, wrap it around to the back, and use that guided foot in order to get exactly the perfect stitch in just the right place and get that binding attached by machine. This method has served me well, and I love the look of the way it comes out. It's just so clean and simple. I do every now and again miss the backside of the binding because obviously you can't see through the quilt unless you have x-ray vision. So every now and again I do miss the edge of that binding, but a lot of times I can just simply go back and just kind of finagle it and finesse it a little bit, and I'll go over it with another stitch and I'll usually be able to catch it then. So I hope you like this tutorial on how to machine bind your quilts using some glue basting. Super easy, and don't forget, like I said at the beginning, you don't have to hand bind your quilts in order for them to be entered into quilt shows. The quilting police will not come after you if you machine bind your quilt. If you liked today's video, give it a thumbs up, let YouTube know that you liked my video, and then of course, if you will subscribe, if you like today's content, you'll get more videos like this in the future, and of course, tell your friends about this video and share it with them. Thanks for joining me today, and remember guys, normal is just a setting on the dryer. Bye!